Democrats are using the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection to press forward with their efforts for voting reform. At least 19 states have passed restrictive voting laws in the year since the attack. Critics argue the new legislation will make voting more difficult and less accessible for millions of Americans. The new laws come in the wake of former President Trump's baseless claims that there was widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. Those claims have been proven false. However, the narrative still resonates with many Trump supporters nationwide. Earlier, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer slammed lawmakers who have imposed new restrictive voting laws, saying President Trump's, quote, big lie is spreading through state legislatures.
Let's be abundantly clear. These new anti-voter laws are on the books today only because their authors cited the big lie, cited the fictitious bugaboo of voter fraud, and are trying to succeed where the insurrection failed. Unless we confront the big lie, unless we all do our part to fortify and strengthen our democracy, the political violence of January 6th risks becoming not an aberration, but, God forbid, the norm.
For more on this, I want to bring in CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Also joining us is CBS News election law contributor David Becker. David is also the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Ed and David, welcome. So, Ed, why are Democrats choosing today as the day to push for voting rights reforms?
Because they see what happened a year ago today as the prime example of why they need to pass what they hope would be sweeping federal changes to election laws across the country, believing that a national standard is needed in order to avoid these state-by-state skirmishes over the details of who has to submit ballots when and what signatures or what identification needs to be used, trying to nationalize the standard so that everybody is on a level playing field. The two proposals in the Senate that Democrats are pushing under current Senate rules have no hope of passage because they have no Republican support. But given the tentpole that is today and the concerns that our polling and others have shown this week that Americans have about the future of elections, the fragility of American democracy, Democrats figure use today to help build momentum for something they're going to try to do by Martin Luther King Jr. Day and probably are going to fail to do given the lack of Republican support.
David, let's talk about what's happened in these 19 states that have enacted new voting restrictions. We can't describe everything that's happened in all 19 states, but if you were to identify things that have transpired in those states that you regard as worrisome to the future of American democracy, what would they be, if any?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there are, of course, laws that are making it somewhat harder to vote in a lot of states. But the provisions of the laws that concern me the most are the ones that inject chaos and confusion into the ballot counting and certification phase after an election, and also criminalize the professional conduct of election officials all around the country. So you see things such as laws criminalizing professional election administration behavior by the election professionals in places like Florida, Texas, Iowa. You also see provisions in places like Texas that empower and almost encourage partisan poll watchers to run roughshod over polling places, interfering with the process. These are very concerning. We should be strengthening the guardrails to prevent interference with an election based on lies like former President Trump attempted in Georgia and other states in 2020, and instead trying to strengthen those guardrails so that that kind of interference with the outcomes, the will of the people, can't occur.
David, real quick before I hand it over to Elaine, on that question of empowering poll watchers or imposing criminal fines for just the administration of election, are either of those legally challengeable? I mean, is it likely in those states there will be litigation to either blunt or stop that, or are they basically on the books and are going to stay there?
Most of them are likely on the books. I mean, the Florida and Texas laws, I think, I don't believe they're subject to any current challenge. The Texas law is subject to challenge right now from the Department of Justice, but I don't believe that provision is part of it. And then now there are areas in which there can be challenges. There are threats against professional election officials happening in places like Wisconsin right now, completely baseless threats, threatening to arrest members of the Wisconsin Election Commission, perhaps staff on the Wisconsin Election Commission, simply for having done their jobs particularly well. And of course, there could be legal challenges there. If anyone attempts to charge someone with a crime, those defendants will put up a vigorous defense and perhaps have alternatives that they can then affirmatively raise, such as malicious prosecution and abuse of power. So anyone attempting to raise those kinds of things to harass election officials in that way should be very wary of that.
Well, Ed, you're there in Michigan, one of the states where we know more than a year after the 2020 election, many election officials still face threats. And Ed, you spoke with Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who had armed protesters show up at her home in the last election. Here's some of what she told you.
I know among the other unfortunate aspects of all this is that people like you become the target of either threats of violence or in some cases actual violence.
Yes, I mean, in many ways, election administrators personify democracy. So to the extent that people want to attack democracy, undo, dismantle, intimidate those from participating in democracy, we become the manifestation of those threats. Threats targeting ourselves, our families at the state and local level have been nearly constant for almost 2 years now, because it really began in early 2020 here in Michigan. And so it's tiring, but it's made most of us more resolute and determined to ensure that we protect democracy.
So, Ed, tell us more. What types of threats are officials facing, and are those behind the threats being prosecuted?
Well, I mean, it's everything from people showing up at the homes of these elections officials, like Secretary Benson, and her children being threatened. She says now her family's essentially used to having security. Other elections officials across the country have conveyed much the same, that police have had to be at their home or escort their families around town out of concern for their safety. Some have described the voicemails or the emails they've received from people who use all sorts of four-letter words to lash out at them for whatever reason. It sadly has become the norm. But as Benson said to us, you know, these are people across the country who understand that what they're trying to do is maintain the integrity of elections and of democracy, and that if this now is part of what comes with the territory, most of them are willing to endure it. But it is a sad reality that in many of these instances, it has forced them to get security, to scale back their lives in some way. And yes, it leads to prosecutions or at least investigations in several different states. And it's not just elections officials. Remember, lawmakers, and this has been something unfortunate that's been going on for years, face threats and have had to install security systems in their home or get assistance from local police when they go out and about. It's just another example of the ongoing intensification of our politics at a time when the country is so deeply divided.
And David, I want to follow up on what Ed O'Keefe just said, because there are elected officials, and with elected officialdom comes some sort of public exposure, and sometimes with that, intense criticism, never threats of violence typically, but when you're an elected official, there are certain things that come with the office. But what we're talking about here is also for people who are simple civil servants, carrying out their job to count ballots, do so accurately and verifiable. They also have been hunted, besieged by threats, voicemails, emails, being chased home and the like. You talk to election officials up and down the ladder across our country. What has been your impression of the effect this has had on the very infrastructure of counting votes and doing so reliably and verifiably going forward?
Yeah, for about 2 years now, almost 2 years, election officials from statewide elected officials like Secretary Benson and her colleagues as other secretaries of state, all the way down to volunteer poll workers and IT staff and other staff in election offices have found themselves the targets of vicious threats, death threats, not only directed at them, their facilities, their staff, their families, their children. And this has been going on for a long time. They feel as if they are under siege. In fact, this has gotten so bad that my organization, the Center for Election Innovation and Research, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit, partnered with former Obama White House counsel Bob Bauer and longtime Republican election lawyer Ben Ginsberg, who represented both the W. Bush and Romney campaigns, to form the Election Official Legal Defense Network, which pairs election officials with pro bono attorneys to help them. And sadly, this is necessary, and we've had many requests for assistance and paired many with lawyers to help them with things like harassment, things like threats, and even things like potential criminal prosecutions that might be coming down the path. This is not something we've ever had to deal with. This hasn't happened a little bit before. It has happened not at all before. This is entirely new and is directly as a result of the lies being spread by the losing presidential candidate and the ecosystem of grifters that have surrounded him.
Well, Ed, several candidates on upcoming ballots attended January 6th rallies last year, and you spoke with John Rocha, who is running for state representative in Michigan, about his experience that day.
We were there on the grounds, and we saw people, climbing the scaffolding. We could see that. We could see the explosions of the tear gas and things, so we could see that stuff. But you couldn't see any of the interactions up front. You couldn't see anybody going inside. You couldn't see any of that happening.
What did you think when you saw them scaling the scaffolding?
I thought, it's interesting because I didn't really understand. It was my first time to D.C., so I didn't really know what was going on. It was hard to partake and understand what was really happening. It was happening so quick. I didn't know what to think of it, honestly. It was one of those things where it was in the moment, you saw it happening, you're going, what's going on? Or are people, is this really happening? Are people going to go inside? We didn't know. I had no idea what was happening. People climbed the scaffolding, and that's kind of where it seemed to be ending. People flew flags and cheered, and that was pretty much what, from our vantage point, seemed to be the end of it.
Right. Because it's not every day people climb the scaffolding at the Capitol.
Sure.
What compelled you to go to Washington in the first place?
Well, I wanted to, express my First Amendment. I wanted to go ahead and be a part of the protests. I felt there were enough irregularities in the 2020 election that there needed to be redress of grievances in our First Amendment that allows us that opportunity to do so.
So, Ed, what more can you tell us about candidates like John Rocha as we look ahead to the midterms?
So CBS News has found about 31 people running for state or federal office across the country who were in Washington on January 6th and attended those rallies, either outside the Capitol or got inside. In Rocha's case, he's one of 6 here in Michigan who were in Washington a year ago for those events. As he said, he never got inside the building. He stopped short of it and actually had to leave town by mid-afternoon. And as you saw there, described his experiences. He's one of those in this state who's pushing for yet another what he calls forensic audit of the results, on top of the hundreds that have already been conducted in this state and, of course, across the country, arguing that there are concerns about how ballots got from the voting site to the processing centers to eventually getting reported into state officials, and believing that the election was taken from Donald Trump, not stolen, but taken. I pressed him. I said, is Joe Biden the legitimately elected president of the United States? He said, well, the laws of the country say he is. I said, well, what do you think? And he's one of those that says, no, it was taken from the president and doesn't have any hard evidence to back that up. Rocha is endorsed by the former president, one of 15 Michigan Republican candidates running who've been endorsed by the former president. Notably, he's never talked to the former president, but was endorsed by him, presumably because of his outspoken work to try to figure out what went wrong. And we should clarify, he is a state legislative candidate. He had at one time launched a primary campaign against Congressman Upton, but switched races to this more local race, admitting that it's a little expensive and lofty to be running for Congress. So instead, he's got his eyes trained on the state capitol here in Lansing instead.
Ed, we can all see behind you the beautiful Capitol Dome in Lansing, Michigan, a state where electors were provided with an armed police escort when submitting their electoral votes for President Biden. How is Michigan a case study of election administration for the rest of the nation? Is it?
Well, it's a fertile battleground, and it's one of several. And you have to consider that it's not only a battleground this year, much like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin as well, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but that what happens this year and what is able to be stopped or what may happen, depending on who's elected, sets the table for the bigger contest in 2024. And what do Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan have in common? Those are essentially the 5 states where it was all decided in 2020 and where it very well could be again in 2024. And all of those states this year have statewide elections of some sort that will determine the balance of power in the legislature, or who's the governor, or who's the Secretary of State. And if critics argue, like our friend here, Mr. Becker, if certain people are put in power after this year's elections, they could be rewriting the rules or greasing the skids for the former president to ensure that things happen his way next time, even if the results suggest otherwise. So that is the extreme concern. And so Democrats understand that this, along with all the other issues that are going to be on the ballot, is one that they have to get voters concerned about. And as Secretary Benson said to us, she said, look, this is something that should concern every American who believes in the truth. And she's concerned that in Michigan and in other states across the country, there isn't enough outrage among the majority of Americans who believe in the truth, believe that the election was held legitimately and that Donald Trump lost, that they're not concerned enough and not galvanized enough and not speaking out enough and doing enough to stop those like John Rocha, who we heard from winning office. And so, you know, how that continues to be a fight here and in those other states will be one of the more alluring and important subplots of this entire cycle. And again, very well could set the stage for a tricky election cycle going into 2024.
Well, David, former President Trump has relentlessly pushed this notion of widespread election fraud, and he continues to do so. How do those Republicans who support him in that baseless claim explain being voted in on the same ballot that Mr. Trump lost?
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you look at the legislators, almost all of them in the states where there had been these baseless challenges were on the very same ballots. In the case of the members of Congress who objected to the election results, every single one of them was on the very same ballots. And just to show how detached from reality these claims are, my organization released a fact sheet today on why we know the 2020 election was the most secure, transparent, and verified election in American history. And people can find that at electioninnovation.org. But Michigan's a perfect example of this. Michigan in 2016 had a margin of under 10,000 votes. President Trump won that state by under 10,000 votes. It had paper ballots, and it didn't really have audits of those ballots. In 2020, they still had paper ballots, but they had robust statistical audits of those ballots, which confirmed the results. And the margin was almost 20 times as great as the 2016 margin. In fact, the Republican leadership of the state Senate issued a report that confirmed the results of the outcome of the 2020 election in Michigan, just as all of the unnecessary reviews of the election that occurred now well over 400 days after the election. Every single one of them have confirmed the results. No one has been able to find or manufacture any evidence of fraud. So I think it's very hard for a lot of the individuals to reconcile their raising of doubts about the election. And yet we still have many, many people in the state legislatures and in Congress who either are actively spreading lies or at a minimum remaining quiet in the face of the lies about the 2020 election.
Well, January 6th a year ago felt very much like an inflection point. It continues to feel that way today. Ed O'Keefe and David Becker, thank you both very much.